Christ is risen from the dead by dead, have you trampled down death, and on those who are risen, it is glorified. Each and you temple proud, you will not
Our Father which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Lead us not into temptation, and deliver us from evil one. Glory to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, both now and ever, and unto the ages of ages. Amen. Lord of mercy, Lord of mercy, Lord of mercy, Holy Mass of Amen. In the life of our Holy Father Stephen, the first Bishop of Perm, who reposed in the year 1396, Holy Mass of us. Once the righteous Procopius of Astute fell at the feet of Mary, a young girl 3 years old, meanwhile exclaiming, "There goes the mother of the great Stephen, bishop and teacher of Perm." St. Procopius' words seemed strange and improbable to the people of Astute. It was no marvel to them that the fool for Christ's sake could know that the son of this little girl would be a bishop, but it appeared wholly unlikely that the Ziriani would accept the Christian faith, and that in barbarous and pagan Perm there would one day be an Orthodox bishop. Therefore the townspeople of Astute did not even believe the saint's prophecy, for they were well aware how mean the mental and moral development of the Ziriani was. They knew how blindly and fervently they were devoted to the very crudest idol worship, and they knew of the power wielded over them by wizards and sorcerers who were implacable enemies of everything Russian and of everything Orthodox, and who, to their own profit, held the Ziriansky people in the darkness of heathenism. Christ is risen from the dead by death, we trample down death, and all those in the graves to bestow. For us, this opinion of the people of Astute about their Ziriani shows all the more clearly the difficulties that had to be surmounted by one who was to resolve to enlighten the Ziriani with the light of the faith of Christ. What wisdom, what a gift of speaking must he be master of, so that he might communicate in their coarse and impoverished language and impress upon their savage minds and hearts the exalted truths of the gospel, thus turning them away from their long-standing idolatry. How necessary it was for the preacher to possess self-denying love and patience, lest he succumb and give up in the face of his countless fanatical adversaries and every possible hindrance and peril. Verily, for this an apostle was necessary, and such a one appeared to the Ziriani in the person of Stephen, who long before his birth was foreordained for this ministry. The illuminator of the Ziriani was born in rich mercantile Astute, of parents, though not wealthy, yet pious, and according to their station, more able than others to give their son the necessary book learning, then a rarity even among the rich and learned. His father was Simeon, surnamed Snoring, a goodly cleric of the main church, and his mother was that same maiden to whom St. Procopius' prophecy concerning the birth of Stephen, bishop of the Ziriani, was once attributed. Through the comfort and joy of his pious parents, the child in his very infancy began to manifest within himself a brilliant aptitude and love for study. Year by year he began to progress in reading and writing, and quickly outstripped all his peers. After studying for only 1 year, Stephen could discharge the duties of canonarch in the main church, and he later became a church reader. By nature endowed with a quick intellect, the child soon took part. Within a year, he was able to chant the verses for the choir. He progressed beyond all conceiving. He engrossed himself in God's word, both with grace and exactitude. He gave himself up to his books and the assiduous understanding of the Holy Scriptures, and did not mingle in the currents of vain things, says one of his contemporaries. The God-fearing and gifted youth, because he apprehended his calling, took pains to prepare himself the more quickly by the study of the sacred Scriptures. At the same time, by a certain mysterious movement of the heart, he began to study the Ziriansky language assiduously on his own. He sought occasions to meet the Ziriani, He talked with them and asked them the names of this or that object, and in this manner not only did he soon begin to understand their tongue, but he also began to talk with them like a native Syrianian. This strange association of the God-fearing youth with the rude pagans more than once brought to his mother's mind the prophecy of the fool for Christ's sake, and showed that even from his childhood the grace of God rested upon him, that the inscrutable paths of providence were preparing him for an apostolic achievement for difficulties. When he reached adolescence, he felt no inclination towards anything worldly. Stephen spent day and night in reading the sacred books and those of the fathers, but the more he studied them, the more he realized that his knowledge was still little and inadequate. The thirst for knowledge welled up in him more and more, so much so that finally Stephen, seeing that it was impossible to quench this thirst in his youth, resolved to leave his hometown and go to Rousseau, the cathedral city of that land, where he hoped to complete his education. Stephen's inclination towards the monastic life was of no mean help in his making this decision. There abuts the ancient many-domed and turreted Rostovsky Kremlin on the south side, an oblong quadrangle surrounded by walls, and at its west end stands a tall church with 5 cupolas, still solid in appearance, but with its doors walled up, because the interior of the building is dilapidated, it is not open to visitors. It stands even today as a sad memorial of the so-called hermitage or monastery of St. Gregory the Theologian, which in ancient times was famed for the wealth of its library and the learning of its monks. On his arrival in Rostov, the youthful Stephen directed his steps thither, consumed as he was with a desire for enlightenment and a life of asceticism. When he had been received into the company of the brethren, he applied himself with tireless zeal to the reading of books, at the same time strictly fulfilling all the requirements of the monastic life, so that at the time when Parthenius was bishop of Rostov, regardless of his tender years, he was deemed worthy to receive the monastic tonsure at the hands of Maxim Kalin, the abbot of the monastery of St. Gregory the Theologian. Here the broad meadows of godly reflection were laid open to the knowledge-loving mind of the young monk, meadows overflowing with the dogmatic nourishment that he so heartily desired. Zealously immersing himself in the reading of books, Stephen strove to search out by himself the interpretation of that which had earlier seemed incomprehensible to him. He studied and learned the Greek language so that everything that was difficult to understand in the Slavonic translation would become clear to him. And at last, by his independent study of the Christian truths and in frequent conversations with learned brothers, he acquired a fundamental knowledge of the truths of the Orthodox faith. Epiphanius, his biographer, who lived at the hermitage at the same time as Stephen, recalled with some consolation how it often befell they would argue among themselves concerning certain matters, now about a word, now about some verse or hymn. In the monastery of the theologian, Stephen wrote out many books with his own hand, which for a long time served to demonstrate his godliness and love for his labor. In the quietness of the monastery, Stephen, with flaming love for enlightenment, never yielded to anyone in monastic endeavors, thus perfecting himself more and more in the spiritual life. He came to church for the services before all others and left after everyone else. He spent day and night in fasting, prayer, and making prostrations. He schooled himself in humility, meekness, patience, and love, so he might suffer every adversity and affliction for the Lord, without harming the works of faith or the salvation of his soul. In his struggle with humble heart, in his flaming ardent and love for God, all this seemed little and insignificant. He desired to offer his whole being as a sacrifice to God, and wished this whole life could be spent in giving glory to the name of God. Now, one day, when he was fervently praying about this, as if in answer to his petition, there came to him a good thought, to become the illuminator of the Ziriani, whom he had known since childhood, and who were walking in the darkness of the most obdurate paganism. Tears of joy bedewed the face of the Blessed One, as if he had come upon some great treasure. He recalled the fool's prophecy, and the strange attachment to the Ziriani that had held him since his childhood years, and his desire to learn the Ziriansky tongue became comprehensible to him. He now saw that God's providence had foreordained him precisely for this achievement. Having formerly studied the Ziriansky language for no particular purpose, but only for the sake of his love of knowledge, he now began to trouble himself, wondering how to translate the lofty truths of Christian learning into their mother tongue for these savage children of nature, how to make them intelligible in their dialect. Although Stephen was conversant with the Zuriansky language and spoke it fluently, the problem before him was great and difficult, and one cannot but marvel at the patience, vigilance, and ability of the Blessed One with which he applied himself to the uncultured and impoverished Zuriansky tongue, one that had no literature, and lacked words for many matters and abstract ideas necessary for a comprehensible rendering and translation of the exalted verities of the Christian faith. It was necessary to invent an alphabet to express the sounds of their speech, to compose words which the Syriani lacked, and to do this in such a manner as will be understandable while exactly expressing the meaning of the idea. Even greater labors were required. The exposition in Slavonic was not sufficiently clear, and so it would prove necessary to translate from the original Greek. However, the outstanding ability of Stephen and his love of labors mastered all this, the translation of several service books into Zuriansky being the fruit of his scholarly labor. He spent almost 10 years in the monastery of St. Gregory the Theologian, engaged in labors of learning, preparing himself for the struggle of preaching the gospel. When he had gathered together the service books necessary in the Zuriansky translation, he felt himself sufficiently prepared for preaching the gospel. The Blessed Stephen set out for Moscow so that he might ask the first hierarch of the Russian Church for his blessing, and also for his counsel, and for instructions concerning this extremely difficult undertaking. On arriving in Moscow, he had never as yet met the energetic great hierarch and champion of the Russian Church, Metropolitan Alexis. The Simonovsky Archimandrite Michael, spiritual father of the Grand Duke, then administered the affairs of the Church, acting as Metropolitan designate. And although he was haughty, presumptuous, and arrogant even in the presence of the bishops, he courteously received this humble hierodeacon. Being an intelligent man, he at once fully understood both the importance and the advantage of the undertaking, and he petitioned the Grand Duke on Stephen's behalf for a charter of safe conduct. And so he sent him to Gerasim, the Bishop of Kolomna, that he might be ordained to the priesthood. He enjoined the bishop to supply Stephen with every necessity for his great mission. "Bless me, Vladika, to go to the heathen land of Perm," said Stephen, falling at Gerasim's feet. "I wish to teach the holy faith to those unbelieving peoples. I resolve either to bring them to Christ or to lose my head at their hands for my Christ." Vladika Gerasim, an old man already well advanced in years, marveled at Stephen's apostolic zeal and courage. Seeing his special calling to these apostolic deeds, he conversed at length with him, inspiring him for his spiritual endeavor. "Child Stephen, son and fellow servant of our humility and the Holy Spirit, go in peace. May the grace of God be upon you. May the Lord of glory himself travel with you, and bestow upon you that speech of great power that he gives to them that publish the good tidings. Take upon yourself the whole armor of God, according to the word of the apostle. Take the shield of faith, the helmet of salvation, and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. Go forth, and may your word be savored with salt. May it be living and effective, and may the Holy Spirit decide when to speak and what to say, so that the hearts of the unbelievers may be turned to the light of faith." So spoke the archpastor. When he had ordained Stephen priest-monk, he provided him with the holy antimension, holy chrism, particles of sacred relics and other sacred things, and he sent him forth with prayer and a blessing. Accordingly, when he had safeguarded his undertaking and respected both the ecclesiastical and the civil authorities, the Blessed Stephen set out from Moscow to the place of his missionary activities. On coming to Vologda, he started out on the waterways from Suchon to Ostyug, and thence he went along the northern Dvina as far as his junction with the Vichegda, where, in those days, the settlements of the Zuriani began. This was in the autumn of 1379. Epiphanius says of this, the commencement of his spiritual brother and fellow struggler's preaching ministry, "Like as a sheep among wolves, he began to go about preaching Christ the true God, and teaching the Christian faith in the midst of a stubborn and perverse generation." Such a typical report concerning Zuriani, being that of a contemporary, already gives one a close understanding of their moral composition. Many were the difficulties and struggles, the losses and afflictions that Stephen had to suffer. Great hindrances and all manner of perils had to be overcome before his preaching was crowned with a certain success. Here, for the first time, Christianity, in the person of a lone stranger, had to jostle with the paganism of the Zuriani, and Stephen's 10-year preparation had to endure its first trial. Almost everything depended on whether the start was successful or a failure. The success of his preaching would open the way to the hinterland for Stephen, providing him with fellow travelers and helpers, and paving the way for publishing the good news in the furthest reaches. On the contrary, the failure of his first sermon would have brought about a complete reversal. Then maybe the Zuriani would have long remained in their heathenish darkness. Such were the thoughts of the preacher himself. And on the day following his arrival in the Zuriansky territories, whereupon he preached his first sermon, he determined upon the construction of a church in honor of the holy archangels. So doing, he gave thanks to the blessed spirits for the victory which they had wrought over the spirits of deception. That we may see more clearly and better appreciate the magnitude and troublesomeness of Stephen's apostolic exploit in propagating the gospel among the Zuriani, we should briefly refer to those countless and various drawbacks, the like of which awaited him in this savage land, making mention of the intellectual, moral, and social condition of that race, among whom he hastened to implant the truth of the gospel. The Finnish tribe of the Zuriani, which dwelt in a wild and inclement land, did not enjoy the benefit of sound government. The people loved to pass their lives in noisy and abominable revelings. The tribe was violent and quarrelsome, disdaining the bonds of kinship and friendship, and allowing no curb on its savage license. The intellectual development of the Zuriani ascended only to the very basest degree to that of paganism, to which they were blindly attached, it being the religion of their forefathers. It indulged their wild passions, and in their own interests, the wizards and sorcerers, who exercised enormous influence over the common folk, fostered ignorance and superstition among them. The chief deities of the Zuriani, Voipal and Jamala, demanded of them neither fasting nor abstinence, nor yet other such moral disciplines. They were propitiated by material gifts, and the remaining gods were even more indulgent. For a fox skin, that of a marten, or for some 10 white squirrel pelts, they were prepared to forgive anything. It is true that the Zuriani worshipped and deified all things, the sun, fire, water, stones, trees, and living beasts. They had a belief in good and evil spirits, and even acknowledged a single great spirit, N. But in their opinion, the good spirits who propagated goodness throughout the world did not demand any recompense, and therefore they were not held in any very great esteem. And the great spirit N they considered to be too transcendent to worship. They did not dare to portray him or to offer him oblations. The magicians and sorcerers profited by this profound reverence and superstitious veneration, for they were the proclaimers of the will of the gods and acted on their behalf. They were the supreme masters of the wealth of the temples, and of everything offered to the gods as gifts. These things they utilized to their own advantage. Now they show themselves to be Stephen's most spiteful enemies and persecuted him with fanatical hatred. In such a religious moral state, the ignorant, undeveloped, and superstitious Zuriani were obviously too poorly prepared to comprehend the nobility and sublimity of Christianity. The social conditions and circumstances in which the Zuriani found themselves were no less unfavorable for Stephen's work. For centuries they had been vassals of the citizens of Novgorod. This dependency was not only not burdensome to them, but in many instances was to their advantage, because the Novgorodians did not interfere with the government of their country, nor did they involve themselves with the interior affairs of it. They were satisfied solely with the payment of tribute money. For their part, the Zuriani were the more willing to pay the tribute, the more they profited by trading with the merchants of Novgorod. And as they, the Zuriani, were their own subjects, the Novgorodian boatsmen gave them less occasion for offense. However, shortly before Stephen arrived to preach the gospel, Moscow had wrested them from Novgorod and submitted them unto her own rule, and required them certain advantages and benefits. The Muscovite government increased requisitions and taxes upon the Zuriani. The tribunes, informers, and overseers of the Grand Duchy quickly became so tiresome and hateful to the Zuriani that everything that came from Moscow seemed to them suspect and hostile. It was only the fear of the Grand Duke's wrath that kept them in subjection. Stephen came from Moscow bearing a charter from the Grand Duke, and this alone sufficed to repulse the Zuriani, to sow mistrust among them. Such was the ground upon which Stephen came to spread the word of God. Obviously, it would not have been easy to find a time more unfavorable, nor an audience less apt or less ready. However, inflamed with apostolic zeal, the blessed Stephen paid no attention to these things, but with unshakable hope on heaven's aid, he immediately set about his task. The first Zurianic settlements, which became as Piras, now called Kotlas, near the point where the river Vichegda meets the Dvina, some 40 miles from Astiug. The inhabitants of this village, because of their proximity to Astiug and the parts lying adjacent to the Russian lands, were somewhat more progressive than the others, and they understood the Russian language. When they heard that he spoke with them in their own tongue, and that so well that he conversed like a native Zurianin, they welcomed him with special rejoicing. Other than this, his labors in preaching here did not meet with any success for a lengthy period. When Stephen began to preach to them concerning the falsity of their gods and the sanctity of the Christian religion, these barbarous folk, being devoted to the worship of their idols, at first did not even wish to listen, and they refused the preacher's kindly admonitions. Not being in a position to refute Stephen, they strove to drive him away and cast him out from their midst. They heaped various insults and outrages upon him. Once they swept up a pile of wood and collected straw together so that they might burn him alive. The blessed Stephen, without regard for such hindrances and perils, with unperturbed meekness and patience, continued to exhort his hearers to abandon the darkness of idolatry and to turn to the true God, whom they called En, the creator of heaven and earth. With tears he besought them to save their souls, and in the end he touched their rude hearts. Little by little the villagers began to be convinced of the truth of the preacher's words, to understand the idols for as naught, and to acknowledge their error. And not only did they readily listen to his sermons, but they themselves began to beg Stephen to instruct them in the Christian faith. In this manner all Pyrrhus renounced paganism and was baptized. Only the most inveterate heathen refused to accept the Christian faith, and they withdrew to the populous village of Ham, where the main pagan temple, filled with the idols venerated by the people, was situated, and where too the chief priests lived in plenty. People from afar gathered here in crowds to worship their gods. With joyous tears, Stephen gave thanks to God for the first fruits of his ministry. He erected a cross in the center of the village, built a chapel, and having confirmed the newly illumined in the faith, he chose certain of them as companions, and set off with them, traveling further up the course of the Vichegda, the banks of which were exceedingly densely populated by the Zuriani. As he arrived at the villages along the way, everywhere beset by obstacles and dangers, he preached the name of Christ. He set up crosses and chapels, they being the most readily comprehensible symbols of their new faith for these simple folk. In a short time he had converted to Christ all those dwelling between Paris and Ham, the distance of more than 130 miles. In Ham they already knew of the appearance of a Muscovite evangelist in Paris, one who censured their gods and their religion. Consequently, the priests and warlocks endeavored to turn the people against Stephen, and they, like hungry wolves snatching at their prey, prepared to resist him fiercely, for they were consumed with fury. But Stephen knew that the idolaters were gathering their forces against him, and that considerable obstacles awaited him there, obstacles that had been set in his way by people who had been incited against him, and more particularly by the priests, who were exasperated by the progress that his mission had made. He knew, too, that the preaching work would be fought with new and perilous trials, that were the preacher ever irresolute and unstable, those who had already turned to Christ might fall away as a result. The flame of apostolic zeal for the illumination of those in the delusion of error, and heartened by his foregoing success in preaching, in which he acknowledged God's unfailing aid, Stephen resolved to push on with his endeavor. Although he was menaced by the greatest perils, he was able by means of these to show the people that all these things are insignificant, and thus he was also able to expose the powerlessness of the idols and the deceits of the avaricious priests. The blessed one decided either to gain the victory or to die. He entered Ham alone. Incited by the malicious priests and sorcerers, the villagers rushed upon him with furious shouts and threats, so that he could say nothing in his own defense. They did not listen to his greeting, nor did they wish to understand his appeals and proposals, which he made for the love of peace. They paid no attention to his humble apologies, and hope in God alone remained to him, and God saved him. Although in a moment of wrathfulness, the raging mob, incited by the sorcerers, had been prepared to murder him, when the Hamichi noticed the newcomer's meek face, his good and humble appearance, and that he was not at all at pains to resist them, the attacks of rage departed from them. And the meek words with which Stephen appealed to them, asked that they attend to him and be indulgent, his moving persuasions which breathe love, delivered as they were by a stranger, yet in their own mother tongue, these completely disarmed. However, Stephen perceived that the people of Ham were too attached to their idols, and that until they were destroyed, his mission could have no great success. The temple was situated apart from the village, was surrounded by forbidden groves. Therefore, at a chosen time, when none of the pagans were in the vicinity, Stephen set it on fire, and seated himself nearby in an elevated place to await the arrival of the idolaters. The people of Ham, observing the smoke and the flames, rushed to the temple, which was already completely enveloped in the flames. Nearby they noticed the cause of the conflagration peacefully waiting for them. They were overcome with fear and perplexity, not knowing what to do. Because he had not fled before them, nor hidden from them, they marveled at Stephen's dauntlessness. Surrounding him on every side, and savagely wailing, they raised their hatchets and cudgels against him. They heaped abuse upon him, and threatened him with death, but they dared not lay hands upon him. It would have been terrible had the people of Ham raised their hands against one who had dealt a blow at the gods themselves. The mob became agitated and divided among themselves. Some said, "We must kill or banish him. He's destroying our gods." Others said, "How can we beat an envoy from Moscow? Let the gods punish him themselves." Yet others declared, "The problem is that he does not start up against us himself. If he had but once done this, we would have torn him asunder long ago." Meanwhile, his hands uplifted to the heavens, the blessed Stephen prayed to God with tears, and within the hearing of all, he besought him for the enlightenment of the Hamichi. Then, turning to them, pointing to the burnt-out temple, he sought to reveal to them that the idols were nothing. They were even powerless to protect themselves from the fire. He entreated the people to believe in the true God. A few of the more meek hearkened to his entreaty and were convinced. But the greater part of the crowd, although they did him no harm, remained the obduracy of their idols and of their sorcerers. Just as Noah's dove, finding no rest for her feet on the earth, which was still damp from the waters of the flood, returned to the ark, so the blessed Stephen was obliged for a time to withdraw from the village, which was still full of the stench of idolatrous sacrifices, because he did not expect any great progress, and had no hope of meeting with their approval at that time. Therefore, when he had instructed the newly converted to the faith, he departed with his companions, making his way further up the course of the river Chegda. He came to a halt at the point which joined the river Vima, where in those days the main grouping of Ziriani dwelt. For thence they spread out along the Bichigoda, the Vima, and the Sisol. Here, at the heart of the Ziriansky domain, Stephen began to preach the heavenly truths with particular zeal. The simple of heart listened to the new preacher with astonishment, and they came to be baptized, although only slowly, and with great difficulty did they leave off their superstitions. A certain birch tree was held in the greatest veneration by the Ziriani. It was massive in girth. 3 people were necessary to embrace it, and also in height. It stood on a hillock at no great distance from the village. The Ziriani gathered here from all quarters, bringing with them their finest hunting trophies as sacrifices. Having erected a cell for himself in the neighborhood of the birch, Stephen took advantage of the gatherings of the people, and never did he neglect an opportunity to instruct anyone in the truths of the Christian faith. However, the long venerated birch tree held the minds and hearts of these superstitious folks spellbound, and it was an exceedingly great hindrance to the success of his preaching. So with God's aid, Stephen resolved to reckon with the spirit inhabiting it, and to do so in the presence of the people. With his hope placed in God, Stephen set about cutting down the birch. But to his own astonishment, at each stroke of the axe, he heard plaintive cries resounding through the air, and sobs, as it were, both those of men and of women, of the old and of the young. "Stephen, Stephen, why do you chase us from here? This has been our dwelling place from of old." And at each blow there flowed forth from the tree streams of fetid blood. By the sweat of his brow, Stephen worked the whole day long, Because of the enormity of the birch, he could not undercut it. So when he stopped at the end of the day, he sunk the axe into it and retired to his cell. The following day, when he again set about his task, he saw to his amazement that the axe was lying on the ground and that the birch was whole again, with no sign of his work of the previous day. With fear, he began to chop down the tree once again, and was just able to fell it and burn it on the third day. He understood that by doing this, he was arousing the malice of the fanatics, but he surrendered himself to the will of God. Learning about the destruction of their deity, the heathen assembled and prepared to murder Stephen, who did not respond to their reviling nor to their menaces, prayerfully prepared himself for the struggle ahead. The peacefulness and meekness with which he encountered the Zuriani who were threatening him with death struck some of them, while fear of Moscow restrained others in the murderous act. When the tumult had quieted somewhat, Stephen turned to the people to preach. "Judge for yourselves," he said. "Are your gods powerful when they are unable to protect themselves from fire? Are they gods that are so feeble that lack not only sense but hearing and sight as well? Your deity was not able or capable of defending himself even from me, a weak man. Are not all your other gods similar? How many of them have I alone destroyed? Not one of them rose up against me. The Christian God is not such as these. He sees all, knows all things, is capable of everything. He created the whole world and cares for all, and he is good, particularly to those who know him. I desire good things for you, so I am preaching about the true God to you. He will love you and do good things for you when you worship him with true hearts." Powerful in its striking clarity, this sermon turned the hearts of many Syrians to the holy faith. But such a community of Christians was gathered together around Stephen that he set about the construction of a Christian church, so that the unbloody sacrifice might be offered for them, so that the newly enlumined might receive Holy Communion, which for the want of a church they had been denied until that time. Stephen erected this, the first Orthodox church among the Syriani, on an elevated hillside by the banks of the river Vima, at the point which flows into the Visheta. He dedicated the church to the all-holy Theotokos, the honor and glory of her Annunciation, this being the commencement of the enlightenment of the land of Perm, the Annunciation being the beginning of our salvation. Stephen was tireless and always solicitous for the propagation of the holy faith among the Syriani and for the spiritual enlightenment of his young flock, and so he founded a school near the church. And here he himself worked as the first teacher and director. He taught the children from the Book of Hours, the Psalter, and other church books, which were being translated into the Zuriansky tongue and restored. From among his pupils at the school, he instructed pastors and teachers, themselves native Zurianin, who after his repose, for a long time tended his rational flock. Divine service was celebrated in the Zurianian tongue, so that the congregation could clearly understand it and receive instruction in the doctrines of orthodoxy. Not a few curious people came to the church that he had built, and hearing Christian worship in their mother tongue could not but prefer it to their own pagan worship. Of course, there is nothing strikingly magnificent in the furnishings of the first Zuriansky church, but these barbarous people, having never seen anything better than their own ugly idols, were always impressed by the unearthly expressions of the choirs of the saints and the icons. To them they seemed to be living, kindly, joyful, and to be calling them to themselves. When looking on them in rapture and emotion filled the Zuriani, a thing which had not happened in their heathen temples, and they said to one another, "Let us go to see, to look at God." And such was the power of their age-old customs that many did not wish to receive holy baptism and to cease from their pagan worship, simply because it was the ancient way delivered to them from their forefathers. The more barbarous among them were even prepared to kill Stephen, and had no respect for the charter from Moscow. These last purposely did Stephen and the newly converted Christians all manner of contempt and injury, intending thus to provoke quarrels and brawls. However, the teacher of Christian love and meekness bore everything with a good heart, and his disciples learned to do likewise. Their peaceful sufferance of affliction greatly impressed the Zuriani. Finally, they gathered in great numbers, and by common consent, they concluded that Stephen was a wondrous teacher. He repaid injuries and afflictions with love and forgiveness. How could one not hearken unto him? He would not have been able to despoil our temples and destroy so many of the gods, they said, were he not a servant of the great Spirit who was God, the creator of heaven and earth. After their deliberation, The people began to gather in yet greater numbers around the preacher and to beg him for baptism. With joy, the blessed Stephen received all that came to him and instructed them in the Christian faith. However, as he knew what a perilous influence the idols could exercise over those who had lately been pagans, Stephen was personally at pains to destroy the idols, and with them he burned the rich offerings of pelts. He counseled others to do likewise, and assured by his suggestion, the Ziriani zealously set about destroying the objects of their former manner of worship. They felled the sacred trees and smashed the idols, but the rich furs of foxes, marten, and sable, such as they had formerly offered to their deities as oblations, they presented to Stephen. Nonetheless, he had no wish to avail himself of anything, and delivered everything to the fire, except only the linen and the altar cloths, which formerly pertained to the idols. These were used by his servant Ziriani and Matthew as leggings to wrap about his feet. This was intended as an insult to the demons. Ziriani marveled at Stephen's uncovetousness, seeing that he kept nothing for himself but threw everything into the flames. They were particularly astonished that none of their incantations and sorceries in any way harmed him. At that time a pagan dared to touch the idol's offerings, which were laid out in the temple and in the woods by the workers of the devil. He was unexpectedly struck with horror and rolled by the spasm and fits of demonic possession. Stephen, however, remained completely healthy, and this fact raised him yet higher in the esteem of the heathen and turned the hearts of the people to him as to an unmercenary teacher, to one who did not resemble their sorcerers, but who dwelt under the special protection of his God. When, after the deliberation, the people began to receive holy baptism in greater numbers, and the Annunciation Church could no longer contain all the faithful, the blessed Stephen set about building another more spacious church, choosing for this that very place where the enormous birch tree had once stood. He consecrated it in the name of the holy archangels. Just as the spiritual flock of Stephen had grown and increased, so by an equal measure had the number of pupils in his school increased. Yet the tireless laborer was everywhere successful and found time for all. In church he explained the divine service and instructed the congregation in the faith. The school he taught letters and examined the catechumens according to their abilities. In thanksgiving unto God for the success of his ministry, Stephen built another church in Osvim in honor of St. Nicholas, on his day he had arrived there. Being concerned for the spiritual illumination of the country, he, like a wise host and a careful father, did not lose sight of even the outward well-being and safety of his flock. As it happened, the Ziriani were not frequently exposed to the attacks of the Vogelici, their savage neighbors, and no less to the attacks of the cruel Novgorodian boatmen. Therefore, in order to prevent the destruction of the churches, and to afford the villagers a safe haven in the event of an unexpected enemy onslaught, Stephen ordered that the two hills on which the churches stood should be fortified and encircled by ramparts and moats, so that when necessary they could make adequate provision for defense. It was to be expected that the propagation of Christianity and the erection of churches in Osvim, the very center of Perm, would arouse envy and malice in the hearts of the sorcerers and the warlocks, as also among those who remained inveterate pagans. Hitherto, when encountering Stephen, the sorcerers were not in a position to oppose him, and each time no sooner had they begun to contend with him, they were shamed and vanquished. However, in Prince Parish, or even to this day, the vestiges of the old fortifications may be seen. There lived the ancient of the Vimici, the chief priest and sorcerer and leader of all the magicians and warlocks in Perm, their renowned commander Pamasovnik, that is, Pama the sorcerer. For a greater part of his time he spent in the depths of the impenetrable forest, surrounded by those who had grown old in witchery and divination, by wizards and sorcerers. The Ziriani believed the whole land of Perm was under the rule of his sorceries. They were in absolute submission to him, accepting his every word as divine. They held him in such esteem and reverence that only in the most singularly important and present cases did they dare to disturb him. He had known for a long time about the arrival in Perm of a preacher of the new faith, and he was indignant that this newcomer had burnt the temple in Ham. When he heard that Stephen had not been able to establish himself in Ham, and quickly been obliged to leave, he did not consider it necessary to trouble himself, and he left the local magicians to master and banish the Muscovite. The news that Stephen had not only not been expelled from Perm, but had already reached Osvim, and had built churches there, and had converted almost all the villagers to Christ, threw him into a passion and a rage. He immediately began to make ready to set off for a single-handed combat with Stephen. At one and the same time, he poured forth threats and boasted that he would humiliate Stephen. By means of his sorceries, he evoked dreadful torments both upon the preacher himself and upon those who followed his teaching. Horror spread throughout the newly illumined when they heard of his imminent arrival. Their earlier blind faith in him involuntarily gained strength and power. Those who were as yet not strong of heart, and a distressing confusion was brought upon them. As one alone, Stephen did not sink in spirits, but he was filled with hope in God. While strengthening the congregation in the faith, he peacefully awaited the enemy. Soon Pamasotnik, whom the heathen had been impatiently awaiting, arrived on his beam, and both openly and in secret he set about perverting the newly enlightened. Why, he said, do you leave the ways of your fathers and cease to offer sacrifices to the gods? How can you listen to a man sent from Moscow, the city that oppresses you with taxes? Can any good thing come for you from Moscow? Are they not bailiffs and overseers with taxes and oppressions that come from there? And to whom were you listening? Is he not an immature and unknown Muscovite, young enough to be my grandson? Whereas by my years I am your father and the father of your generation. Do not hearken unto this youthful stranger. Make yourselves strong in the ways of our fathers, so that the gods will not become wroth with us. The people answered him, Old man, the wrath of your God does not terrify us now. They fell at Stephen's hands and will not rise again. Go contend with him about the faith. And if you wish us to believe in you, as we once did, defeat him. In his wrath, the sorcerer told him, I will go and humiliate this teacher. And indeed, he did dispute heatedly with Stephen. You Christians have but one God, said Pamasotnik. We have many helpmates, both in things dry and in the waters. And they provide us with good hunting in the forest, so that from its abundance we supply Moscow, the horde, and even faraway lands. Through divination, the gods acquaint us with news from afar, or with mysteries that are beyond your grasp. Among us, a single man will go out against the bear, and with the help of the gods he kills it. Whereas 10 of your people sit out against a single bear, and even then they often not only fail to fell it, but are themselves mauled. It was not difficult to answer the sorcerer, to show him the preeminence of Christianity over paganism, and further to confute all of Pamasotnik's objections, that finally he was left speechless. Seeing that he could not overthrow Stephen with words, the cunning sorcerer thought to intimidate him, and to wrest victory for himself by guile. After a long dispute, as a warranty of his faith, Pama suddenly offered to walk through fire and water, and he demanded the same of Stephen. Pama was fully convinced that Stephen would never decide upon a foolish undertaking, thus the triumph would remain his. What astonishment and fear were his when Stephen accepted his proposal and said, I have no command over the elements, but the God of the Christians is great. I will go with you. The sorcerer, who had grown old and deceased, began to tremble in fear, but he mastered himself and did not show that he was afraid. He thought that Stephen had only consented verbally, on the surface, so as to strike terror into him, that he would never put his words into effect. In the meantime, Stephen had ordered that 2 holes be cut in the ice in the Vechegda, and that one of the cottages that stood apart from the village be set on fire. When the flames had enveloped it, he said his prayers and blessed the bystanders. Then he took Pama by the hand, so that in accordance with their mutual agreement they might enter the fire together. Only then did the sorcerer realize that he had overstepped the mark with his double talking. Benumbed with fear, he began to go back. Then before all the people he retracted his proposal. Pulling at his clothes, Stephen called him and constrained him, but all to no avail. The enchanter quaked, and begged to be delivered from a certain death. In like manner, he would not consent to go down into the water through one of the holes in the ice, to emerge through the other hole. Then Stephen said to him, Did you not choose these tests of faith yourself, thinking to terrify me? Turning to the people, he asked how they could now respect Pama, when he was demanded they settle their dispute about the faith by fire and water, himself now the truest man, yet did not want to be baptized. What is to be done with him? All the people cried, Sentence the deceiver to death. He cannot be corrected. If he remains alive, he will cause you offense. No, answered the blessed Stephen. Christ did not send me to deliver people to death, but to teach. Palmer does not wish to accept the saving faith, but his own stubbornness chasten him. I will not. However, lest he corrupt the people with his false teachings, unless he sows tares in the clean harvest land of God, he ought to be banished from these parts. The people approved of Stephen's decision, and Palmer the sorcerer was driven forth in dishonor, and with his companions he was exiled to the banks of the Oba. But among the shore-dwelling Ostiaki he made his abode in the village of Altim. As a thank offering to God for his triumph over the wizards, Stephen erected a church to St. Nicholas at Visha. After the humiliation and shameless flight of the sorcerer, from every place which the news of this merely reached, the whole populace, as if awakened from a dream, hastens who was vehement to accept the Christian faith preached there by such an extraordinary and holy teacher. Stephen graciously received everyone, and with meek words he convinced them that the heathen gods were but naught. In time of long public discourses he acquainted them with the Christian religion, and grudging neither labor nor time for this, he thus brought them the knowledge of the Creator of all. Neglecting his own leisure, day and night, he received those Diriani that came to him, contending with those who opposed him and with those in doubt, and instructing the obedient, he strengthened them in the faith. The hillock in front of the church was his favorite preaching place. Tears of compunction bedewed Stephen's face, and his soul was filled with exalting spiritual joy. When on climbing the hillock to preach, he would see 1,000 people thirsting to hear the word of God, and in profound humility beseeching him to baptize them. The Vima and Bechegda rivers were used each day as fonts for the multitudes receiving holy baptism. The zeal of the new converts was expressed by their building 2 new churches, in particular after Palmer the Sotnik's flight, by their abundant offerings given so that the necessary church furnishings could be procured in greater stute, which was then a flourishing trading center and its citizens prosperous. Stephen's successes in converting the Zuriani recalled the memory of the righteous Procopi's prophecy concerning him. Accordingly, the rich and the needy alike hastened to send their offerings for the adornment of the churches of Perm. Many of the clergy, having heard of the apostolic achievements of their countrymen, went to Perm, desiring to become his disciples and fellow laborers in the Word of God. With their aid, Stephen was enabled to order divine service in all the churches that they had built. This contributed greatly to the success of his ministry. Because of their great numbers, the believers were already unable to assemble in one church, and the preacher himself could then devote more time to the instruction of his flock. The blessed Stephen spent 7 years in these apostolic labors, patiently suffering every affront. His only care was for those who turned from the darkness of heathenism to the light of Christ. He was comforted to see how the holy faith was spread through the length and breadth of the extensive region of Lesser Perm. It was such that already proved impossible to satisfy the spiritual needs of all the faithful alone, and to keep a pastoral watch over them. Stephen smashed the idols, and, being still a priest, baptized many of the people, even 1,000. He struggled completely alone for the first 3 years, until such time as he had trained his companions and disciples who were among the converted Syriani, and until the time when a number of the clergy came to him from the stew, having heard of the progress that his mission had made. Seeing the growth of his flock, which was dispersed throughout the wide expanse of Perm, the blessed Stephen resolved to go to Moscow, and by his entreaties to obtain a bishop for the newly converted. In 1383, having arrived in Moscow, he told the Grand Duke Dmitry Ivanovich and the Metropolitan Pimen about the success of his preaching ministry among the Zoryani, pointing out that for the continued propagation of the Christian faith and for the oversight of the newly illumined, it was essential they have their own bishop, because Perm was far from restored. When in Moscow they heard of Stephen's deeds, the better people rejoiced, spoke of the preacher with reverence. But others said, why was this new alphabet invented? In former times they never knew how to read or write in Perm. Why this innovation now? If knowledge of letters is necessary, let Russian suffice. And so they call the blessed Stephen nothing else but snoring, that is simply by his surname. But such were the comments only of those people who were poor in understanding and proud of their own ignorance. The Grand Duke was enthused by Stephen's feats. The harvest is great and the laborers few, which cause let us pray unto the Lord that he send laborers into the harvest. They might be a preceptor and guide for the workers, that I might be his assiduous fellow server and worker in every good deed, said the humble preacher to the Grand Duke and the Metropolitan. However, neither the Grand Duke nor the Metropolitan and the Council of Bishops could find anyone more worthy to occupy the episcopal throne of Perm than Stephen himself. To the God-fearing prince's joy, in the winter months of 1383, they were celebrated the consecration of the greatly beloved and esteemed humble Stephen, who had long been known to him. The Grand Duke valued his personal qualities so highly that he granted him special privileges over and above those that other hierarchs enjoy in the administration of their diocese and in judicial matters. He delivered the whole district of Sveen with its rich meadows and grain fields onto him as an endowment with the right of duty-free commerce for its people. He also handed over to Stephen the taxes collected from the merchants and manufacturers who came to Perm. In Moscow, Bishop Stephen was endowed with rich gifts for his newly established diocese. And on his return journey everywhere, he was greeted by the people of the towns and villages with joy. They witnessed the love for him that the boys, the clergy, and the peasants shared in common. Everyone hastened to receive his blessing, to offer him gifts out of their own goods for the building of churches. Being full of humility and meekness and a stranger to worldly vanity and earthly grandeur, the blessed Stephen was profoundly touched by this unfeigned expression of the people's love. In a contrition of heart, he gave thanks to God for the God-fearing disposition of the people. He did not refuse the oblations offered for the building and adornment of the churches, but he would never accept gifts offered to him personally. Simplicity and austere uncovetousness were the constant companions of his ascetic life, and only earnest entreaties and the fear of offending those who made the offer by his refusal would occasionally prevail upon him to accept something, and then as a provision for unforeseen exigencies and misfortunes that his spiritual children might suffer in their harsh and sparsely peopled land. Having been delayed in the towns by the crowds of citizens who thronged him, Stephen, after his long meandering, at least reached the borders of the Stewg, his homeland, where the whole community was awaiting him impatiently and had betimes prepared a joyous reception. Because of the great distance separating Ostug from Rostov, the inhabitants very rarely had the opportunity to see their own arch-pastor, and now there drew near to them a hierarch born and raised in their own city, and renowned for his apostolic achievements in pagan lands. For this cause, the people's common feeling for him waxed such, they left the neighboring villages, domestic cares were laid aside, infirmities and sicknesses were forgotten, and the old and the young alike sojourned in the town, awaiting the arrival of their native Vladika with impatience, that they might receive his arch-pastoral blessing. At last, the moment of the impatiently awaited encounter arrived. The festive chiming of the bells of all the churches in Ostug announced to the townspeople the arrival of the arch-pastor of Perm. Without noticing that it was winter time, everyone rushed out of the city the sooner to see him. At the city boundaries, the clergy with icons and banners, and the burghers with bread and salt awaited him. Enthusiastic shouts drowned the church singing and the ringing of the bells. In the abundance of their joyful emotions, the people declared their heartfelt feelings and greetings with their tears. Wearing his hierarchical mantia, and surrounded by the resplendently vested clergy, the humble Stephen, while blessing the people, slowly made his way to that very church which he had once attended, where, guided by his father, he had been instructed in church reading and chanting. On entering, he saw before him those very icons before which, as a boy, he had prayed with his father, and in front of them the lamps he himself had once lighted. Among the clergy standing by him, he recognized many of those under whom he had begun his service in the church. The past arose in his memory, and tears of compunction dampened his face. On leaving the church, he fell to the ground, that very place in the church porch, where many years before the righteous Procopi, the fool for Christ, had stopped the young girl, Stephen's mother, and delivered his prophecy about Stephen, calling him the Bishop of Perm. With ardent prayer, he fell down before the already renowned tomb of the fool for Christ's sake. Reverently kissing his holy icon, he sincerely besought his prayerful intercession before God in behalf of himself and his flock. He even visited the abandoned home of his parents and the places beloved of his childhood. He made a tour of the monasteries and churches of the city. He served, preached, visited the sick, comforted the sorrowful, healed those ailing in spirit, and everywhere did good works. There was not a man in the Stewg who did not consider it his duty to give an offering from his abundance for the needs and establishment of the new diocese. The rich and the poor alike besought Stephen to accept their offerings, Meanwhile, in Perm, his disciples were impatiently awaiting him, reckoning the weeks and the days, and having delayed in his homeland longer than he had intended, Stephen made haste to depart for his flock. The joy of the Zuriani was moving. They met him as their father and benefactor. Everyone wept and kissed his habit, according as he had chosen and invited them. A number of the clergy came with Stephen to his fame, which was thenceforth designated the cathedral city. They came to help him to propagate and confirm the faith of those of the Zuriani who yet remained unbelievers. On his arrival in Osvim, he set the original Annunciation Church aside as the cathedral, and made the Archangel's Church the domestic or Stavropitial Church of the bishops of Great Perm, and they lived nearby until the diocese was transferred to Vologda. Having built several cells for the brethren around this church, Stephen founded the first monastery in Perm, named after the Holy Archangels, and which was in existence until 1764. He received elderly Zuriani into his monastery, and he himself served as an example of the ascetical life for them. Those who were able, they ordained as clerics, deacons, and priests, so that not only in the cathedral and in the monastery, but in the course of time, in all the newly built churches, the clergy were native Zuriani. His priests, wrote Epiphanius, served the liturgy, the matins, and vespers in the Permian tongue. His canonarchs led the choirs and books in Permian, and the chanters chanted every hymn in Permian. In addition, the hierarch had to inspect his far-flung flock to see how the newly converted were living in the faith, and if possible, to further the new triumphs of the faith. Therefore, having set his affairs in esteem and order, he hastened to set upon his way. During his visitation, he taught the precepts of family and social life, as well as the dogmas of the true faith. He settled disputes, protecting the weak from the mighty. By his meek discourses and his good works, he bound the people more and more closely to himself. Guided from the time of their enlightenment by his wise counsels, the Zuriani saw for themselves that they rejoiced in such peace, sufficiency, and safety, the like of which they had never enjoyed under their earlier rulers. The tribute did not seem burdensome to them now, because the bailiffs, flying collectors, and tax collectors did not dare to weigh them down with excessive duties, nor did they dare, as they had before, to offend or vex anyone unjustly. For Bishop Stephen, having the right to take part in civil proceedings and in the governance of the country, was always ready to appear in order to aid and protect the oppressed. And many the good shepherd was comforted, seeing the fruits of his preaching, simple-hearted godliness and zeal for the faith, peace and charity and mutual dealings among those who had so lately been so evil and savage. Christianity had visibly regenerated them. However, not everywhere did he chance to meet solely with agreeable things. The villagers of Ham, who had received him on the first occasion with such unkindness that had almost murdered him for burning their temple, were even still barbarous and hostile, although now they dared not venture against him at all. There were also a few who had once received holy baptism and then had been led astray by the warlocks and the sorcerers. They impertinently ventured to say to him that they were once again eating egg white, undoubtedly an avowal of paganism. It would pain the hierarch to hear these things. "O blind people, let Ham be blind," he exclaimed in his grief. From that time until the present day, that district has been called Blind Ham, and the inhabitants of Ham to this day are not only short-sighted and moon-eyed, but are also known as the blind-born. Another occurrence that took place during Stephen's visitation is astonishing in another respect. In the village of Tulim, some 17 miles downstream from Prinsk, a woman, seeing the righteous one's poor footwear, gave him some new poryanki, pieces of coarse linen worn instead of stockings. The Holy One, blessing her simple-hearted good deed, prophesied the place would become a trade center, regardless of its lack of facilities for trading, and actually came about thus. Perceiving from afar the happy state of their fellow countrymen, the Bogolici, those irreconcilable enemies of Christianity, were spurred on by the magicians and wizards who had fled to them in the face of Stephen's preaching and made a pillaging raid upon the land of Perm. Having ravaged the villages on the upper reaches of the Chegda and those on the Sisol, in multitudinous companies, they turned upon Osvim, intent on destroying and setting fire to all that Stephen had built there. With bestial cruelty, they murdered the defenseless countryfolk, laid waste the fields, slaughtered the cattle, and plundered and burned the houses, so that the terrified people abandoned everything to save their lives, and in their terror fled to Osvim in droves. This was in 1385, in the third year of the saint's episcopate. When he first heard the report of the Vogelice invasion, Stephen immediately sent a messenger to Estue with a request that they send troops to resist the adversary and to make the necessary provisions for the protection and defense of the churches. He bade the townspeople take all their possessions to the two fortified hills of the cathedral and the monastery, and to await the enemy there with their arms to hand. Meanwhile, he himself made supplication for God's help and went in procession around the episcopal city, encouraging and heartening the people. Being prepared to lay down his soul for his spiritual children, he did not tarry to await the onslaught of the foe, but clothed in his ecclesiastical vestments, he set out by boat up the river Bechegda with all his clergy and several and certain of the Zeriani, so that he might encounter the adversary. The Vogelice noticed Stephen's boat from afar. His face seemed to them stern. His hierarchical vestments, the like of which they had never seen before, were as if a flame of fire, and he, it seemed to their imagination, was like a fiery arrow. The superstitious pagans, who were audacious rather than courageous, took to flight in terror, leaving behind all that they had plundered from the Zeriani. From that time, they never once dared to approach or to invade Osvim throughout the length of Stephen's life, for they feared the powerful wizard monk Stepi, as they called him. There, thenceforth, they troubled only the far distant Zeriani on the higher reaches of the Bechegda. But in that very year, scarcely had the Vogelice withdrawn from the upper Bechegda than the opposite region, which was more densely populated and richer, was subjected to the incursions of other foes, the Bozemen. The Novgorodians pillaged and despoiled the majority of the lower Bechegda settlements. The zealous pastor hastened to the camp of their wild company, now beseeching the Novgorodians with words of the gospel, now trying to move them to the fear of God. The pirates were repentant. They returned the spoils, made good the damage, then retreated. However, the people had no time to recover and erase the traces of the devastation before other bands of Novgorodians made their appearance and pillaged the villagers anew. Once more, Stephen was obliged to admonish the Novgorodian plunderers and protect his flock. These frequent invasions induced Stephen to set out for Novgorod and to advocate that the city council prohibit the Bozeman's incursions on the land of Perm. As he was visiting Novgorod for the first time and knew no one there, Stephen thought that he would have difficulty in winning the council's favor and obtaining his request, for the council was often unyielding even to the Grand Duke. But to his astonishment, everywhere he met with the people's esteem. In Novgorod, they had long since heard about the hierarch struggles. The Bishop of Novgorod, the aldermen, and the boyars received the apostle Perm in their Church of the Holy Wisdom with great rejoicing, treating him as a cherished guest. They were at pains to put the council at his disposal. The city council even decreed that satisfaction be given for the bishop's just grievance, that those at fault be brought before the council court, that henceforth the whole force of Novgorod be prohibited from touching upon the eparchy of Osvim. His return from Novgorod was a day of rejoicing for his flock, that which Stephen had received in accordance with the council's resolution to compensate for the boatman's pillage, and that which the aldermen and boyars had given him in donations, he dispensed to those who had suffered, giving according to their losses almost measure for measure. With the good archpastor's aid, the people reestablished their former economic standing, and they all but forgot the earlier pillage. Even so, Bishop Stephen's concerns for the good estate of his flock were not brought to an end by this. Another adversary approached, one more terrible and less open to entreaty, famine. It came as if it were to try the faith of the newly illumined, and to make manifest all the brilliance of Saint Stephen's tireless work and fatherly solicitude for his sheep. In 1386, the winter crops throughout Perm failed due to the prolonged and cold spring. The fields were sown again with spring wheat, and thus they exhausted their provisions of grain. But the continued cold weather and the early autumn frost did not even allow this wheat to ripen, and so the people, though it was yet autumn, were left completely without wheat and with no hope for the future, for the fields were fallow. Profiting from this, the merchants began to provide bread at unheard of high prices. The lamentations of the starving distressed the hierarch's soul. He opened his granaries, giving wheat freely to one and loaning money to others, but the misfortune did not lessen. The famine gained strength with each new day, and in distant villages they came to deplorable straits. Many abandoned their homes, and by chewing on the bark of trees they were able to reach a stew, though scarcely alive. Others died of their hunger on the journey. The bishop employed every means to alleviate the terrible poverty. On several occasions he ordered bread from the stew, and when no bread was to be found for sale even there, he sent to Bologna for it. Naturally, because of the famine, the Ziriani were in no position to pay their tribute, which the bailiffs and the Grand Ducal taxmen extorted from them. Bishop Stephen sent a letter to the Grand Duke, in which, having described the poverty which had overtaken Perm and the measures that he had taken to remedy it, he besought a period of tax exemption for the poor. In addition, by his own entreaties, he prevailed upon the taxmen to cease from collecting tribute until they received the sovereign's reply. Stephen's letter did not reach the Grand Duke in Moscow. He had gone to punish Novgorod for the waywardness and pillagings of her boatsmen that had not left even the Grand Ducal patrimony in peace. The sovereign's boyars, receiving Bishop Stephen's letter in the absence of the Duke, did not dare to issue any orders of their own, but only on the return of the prince did they present the hierarch's letter to him. Dmitri Ivanovich was profoundly touched by the mournful plight of the Ziriani, and forthwith commanded that the outstanding debts of former years be forgiven, that the people be freed from taxes for a year, and the losses sustained by the bishop's cathedra be bountifully made good with gifts and monies. Over and above this, a large portion of the countryside near the bishop's city was conveyed to the monastery of the Archangels. The people, hearing of the Grand Duke's mercy, breathed more freely, and began to leave the forest thickets in which they had hidden from the avarice of the bailiffs and tax collectors. Meanwhile, the hierarch further exercised his fatherly care. When they set about sowing the fields, he provided the seed. When it was necessary to procure any domestic working cattle, he loaned the money. If anyone had need of acquiring hunting equipment, he bought it and helped to provide advantageously for game in the forest. Never was a father so solicitous for his children as he was for his flock. The grateful people did not know with what or how to thank him for his good work. Bishop Stephen's paternal anxieties were not limited to cares about the people's outward well-being, were preeminently directed toward their moral betterment and their strengthening in the faith. And in this regard his activity was even more wondrous. A short time after the famine, he succeeded in visiting even the far distant reaches of his eparchy. He was on the Vendenga and the Vishera in the villages of the upper Vichegda. He went as far as the borders of Great Perm, traveling on the rivers Sisol and Luz, everywhere instructing the people in faith and godliness, establishing order, leaving signs of his good works. Attracted by his goodness, those who were still pagans hastened to him in crowds seeking baptism. With paternal love, the hierarch received them and was gladdened by the increase in new children of the church. Stephen raised many churches and founded 4 monasteries, intending that the monks, while giving the newly converted an example of Christian virtue, might confirm them ever more and more in the Orthodox faith. The superiors of the monasteries were ardent fellow strugglers with Stephen. Under his guidance, they endeavored to strengthen and propagate the Christian faith round about their communities. To our misfortune, not only have none of the details of their profitable labors been handed down, but even their very names are now unknown, with the exception of that of the revered Dmitri, founder and superior of the Silovinsky Monastery. Grateful posterity to this day devoutly honors his memory as one who was an assiduous preacher of the holy faith in the vicinity of his community, and as a great saint of God. In 1389, Stephen mourned his exalted benefactor, the Grand Duke Dmitri, who had ever been gracious and affectionate towards him, and always shown such mercy on his newly converted diocese. Stephen was afflicted in spirit by such a loss to the realm. He shed tears and prayed for the repose of the soul of the godly and virtuous sovereign. In a short while, the occasion presented itself for him to see the Grand Duke's successor in Moscow. He was received affectionately by him and made much of. In 1390, Metropolitan Cyprian summoned the hierarch from Perm to Moscow for a council concerning ecclesiastical matters. As he hastened on his journey from Perm to Moscow, Stephen did not visit the Holy Trinity Monastery, which lay some 7 miles off the road, to visit his spiritual brother and friend Saint Sergius, for he thought to do so on the return journey. However, stopping on the road, he said to him, "It is truly me to call thee blessed," bowed towards the monastery, raising his hands in blessing, said, "Peace be unto thee, my spiritual brother." The revered Sergius was at the time sitting with the brethren in the refectory, and discerning in spirit the greeting and blessing that Bishop Stephen had sent him, he quickly rose from the table, and standing for a while he prayed, bowed to the ground, and said, "And thou, shepherd of Christ's flock, rejoice, the peace of God abide with thee." The brethren were astonished by Sergius's unaccustomed rising from the table before the proper time. Several thought he must have had some vision, and at the end of the meal they questioned him about what had befallen. He replied, "In this very hour, Bishop Stephen, traveling to Moscow, stopped over against our monastery, prostrated before the Holy Trinity, and blessed us, the humble ones." The blessed Sergius knew even the place where this had come to pass. In Moscow, the hierarch from Perm met with the particular regard and esteem both of the first hierarch of the Russian Church and of the new Grand Duke Basil Dmitrievich. Together with Metropolitan Cyprian, he sat in council at Tver, trying the bishop of that city, Euphemius, for not observing ecclesiastical statutes. The Grand Duke and his boys presented Saint Stephen with rich gifts, with which he built a hospice in the Archangel's monastery, whereat he received and granted rest to the helplessly poor. The hierarch's warm reception in Moscow and the goodwill the Grand Duke showed him was significant even to the civil functionaries in Perm, who in the further borderlands permitted themselves to use all manner of violence and injustice, and at whose hands the Zuriani suffered grievously. The bailiffs and tax collectors, now being apprehensive of Stephen, abandoned their form of violence and willfulness. In 1392, Perm's neighbor Vyatka, which had been founded in 1174 by immigrants from Novgorod, and which was renowned for its riches and populace, and flourished on account of the industry and commerce of its citizens, was the subject of a Tartar attack and pillage. Her proximity had been beneficial for Perm, both as regards public safety, because she defended Perm from those who dwelt across the Kam, and as regards the development of Zuriansky trade and industry. For the Vyachane, who had held sway over the Vyatka, the Kam, and the Trasova, and in part over the Luz and the Sisol for more than 200 years, had long since gained a reputation for their manufacturing and commercial activities, and they willingly took their Zuriani's forest spoils and furnished them with all that they needed in return. St. Stephen valued the proximity and the prosperity of this enterprising country, especially as the present misfortune that the Atici was suffering had repercussions even for the Zuriani, for it entailed a decline in the local industry of the borderland Zuriansky settlements, brought poverty upon the land, and left it open to the incursions of the spoilers. Besides this, while trading on the Luz and the Sisol, the Vyachane, being Christians, contributed greatly towards the building and adornment of the local churches. However, the calamity that had befallen them embittered the Vyachane. Deprived of all means and reduced to desperation, the Vyachane overran the neighboring Permian villages in multitudinous hordes. They begged for shelter and sustenance, and snatched what they demanded from the peaceable Zuriani. Plunder and slaughter began, just as the Tartars had displaced them, so they went to displace the Zuriani, being intent on taking over their villages. As soon as St. Stephen recognized that the Vyachane, who had once been good neighbors and benefactors, had now become bitter enemies and brigands, he hastened to the Sisol and the Luz to protect his sheep. Having appeared before the Vyachane, the bishop pitied the misfortune that had overtaken them, and he counseled them not to be cast down, not to inflict their sufferings upon others, but rather to strive to repel the Tartars and recover that which they had taken. While assuring them of success, in the event of their doing otherwise, he threatened them with God's judgment and the wrath of the Grand Duke. His labors were not fruitless. The Vyachane returned to their despoiled cities, and joining forces with the peoples of Novgorod and Ustюг, they rose up against the Tartars. They burned many Tartar towns along the Volga, and returned to their homes with rich spoils, thanking the hierarch for his good counsel. St. Stephen's last service to the land of Perm was that he put an end to the villainies of Court Ica, the bandit, after whom the village of Court Keros is named, who had terrified the villagers for a long time. Stephen's holy life and apostolic labors, and even his scholarship, in which he surpassed the other bishops, set him on high in the eyes of his contemporaries, and won for him such respect from everyone that even the Grand Duke bore a special affection for him, and the Metropolitan would undertake nothing of any consequence without consulting him. He constantly summoned him to Moscow for ecclesiastical councils regardless of the remoteness of his diocese. Thus it was that in 1390 he had been in Moscow and Tver, occupied with the concerns of the bishopric of Tver. In 1396, Metropolitan Cyprian once again bade him come on church business. According to the account of his years, Stephen was not as yet an old man, being only 50 years old, but his struggles in his cell, and especially the long years he had labored in preaching, the long and exhausting journeys, his continual cares, and the spiritual sorrows that they brought him, all these had undermined and sapped his health so much that he seemed quite a bit older than he was, and he himself had a foreboding of his repose. When he received the Metropolitan's invitation, the Lord revealed to him that his journey to Moscow would be his last, and that he would not see his diocese again. Parting with the children without having visited them all once more, without having given them his last precept and his blessing, was painful to his fatherly heart, but there was no time for him to make his way through all their villages. Wherefore, while preparing for the journey, he summoned the greater part of his flock to Ozvim, and discoursed for a long time, instructing the congregation from the divine scriptures, and charging them to keep the Christian faith and holiness, and to obey the shepherds of the church. He explained to his priests that he was talking with them for the last time, and that they would not see him again. Just as in former times in Cautlus, when he first entered the land of Perm, he had set about his preaching ministry with ardent prayer, praying upon his knees, so now he brought his preaching activities to their close with prayer in a like manner. Falling upon his knees, he, in the hearing of all the people, entrusted them to the guardian sea of God's providence and to the intercessions of the all-holy Virgin Theotokos. While he entreated others not to grieve at his parting from them, he could not himself refrain from tears. He began to weep for them and for all his flock. This touching scene recalled St. Paul the Apostle taking leave of the Ephesian pastors, the more so because the Apostle of Perm shared much in common with respect to his labors with St. Paul, striving like him to be all things to all men. The Viriani felt and understood who they were being bereaved of in the person of Saint Stephen. They realized how much they would lose without him. They could not find words to extol his virtue. Their mournful groans and lamentations drowned the hierarch's words. Having looked for the last time upon his cathedral church and the Archangel's monastery, wherein he had spent 13 years, Stephen made haste to leave the episcopal city, lest he tear his heart even more. 1,000 people hastened to accompany him. They filled the air with their weeping and wailing, and lamented him as if he were dead. Quickly the speedy horses carried him out of the people's sight. They still stood and wept for a long time, gazing after the hierarch. Thus, for the first time, we were parted from that good worker and our mediator. We pray to God for the salvation of our souls, and is seated before the prince and the boys about our grievances, the discharge of our taxes, and about the things that were to our profit. He was our fervent intercessor before the sovereign master of the world. Many times he delivered us from violence and servitude, and the tribute of the bailiffs. Of their heavy taxes all times he relieved us. Even the Novgorodians themselves, those brigandish boatsmen, were admonished by his words, that they did not war against us. The Zuriani cried as they poured forth their tears. Spiritual disturbances and the prolonged journey, which in those days was accompanied by many inconveniences, hastened the blessed pastor's hand, for his bodily strength was already sapped. On his arrival in Moscow, St. Stephen soon fell prey to a minor ailment, and after being ill for a few days, he perceived that his repose was drawing nigh. Everyone made haste to visit the ailing hierarch, monks and boyars, the Metropolitan, and the Grand Duke himself. The Blessed One received all with rejoicing, struggling against his sickness and trying to conceal his exhaustion. Before the very end, he summoned his companions and talked with them for a long time, recalling his labors. He entreated them to remain firm in the faith, and requested that they take his hierarchical vestments back to his Ozvim, together with his books and house clothes, as a last memorial and as a pledge of his love for his flock. Later, when he had partaken of the holy mysteries, he ordered one of the presbyters to cense his cell with incense, and another he told to begin the reading of the canon for the departure of the soul. Like a navigator who has reached a quiet harbor, a laborer who has finished his heavy work, the hierarch peacefully and joyfully looked upon the bystanders quietly praying to God, and with the prayer still on his lips, his soul imperceptibly departed his much laboring body. Saint Stephen reposed on the feast of Mid-Pentecost on the 26th of April, 1396, in the evening. The Grand Duke, the Metropolitan, with the bishops who had assembled for the council, the boys, the clergy, and a great multitude of the people gathered for the hierarch's burial. Everyone sought to pay their last respects to the Apostle of Perm, and to kiss his venerable and much laboring body. According to the pious sovereign's desire, St. Stephen's relics were committed to the earth in the royal court and the monastery of the Saviour beyond the wall, and the Catholicum by the left-hand wall. Here, in a secluded place, his relics rest even now. His apostolic staff was kept for a long time near the hierarch's reliquary in the Church of the Saviour, and was afterwards set in bone with representations of Stephen's struggles engraved upon it with an inscription, "These are the deeds of Stephen, the Bishop of Perm." But in 1612, at the time of the occupation of the capital by the Poles, Hetman Kotkovich took it from the church and gave it away to the Soprolsky Monastery in the Lithuanian Eparchy. In 1849, at the command of the Holy Synod, the staff of the first Bishop of Perm was transferred to the Permian Cathedral Church. Today it is difficult to trace the boundaries of St. Stephen's extensive diocese exactly, because it lay across the four largest provinces of European Russia: Solvitchegodsk, Urensk, that part of the Vologda region in the estuary of the Sisol, and into a portion of the Mazhensk district of the province of Arkhangelsk. Epiphanius, who had not been to the place where Stephen struggled, was only that he built churches, founded monasteries, taught monks, and appointed abbots, and he does not state precisely how far his ministry extended. We do not know all the places where churches were erected by St. Stephen. But from the monasteries alone, it is possible to judge how extensive his diocese was, be it only approximately. Having slaughtered the preacher Koplas near the mouth of the river Bechegda, he continued as far as Ozvim, which he made the focus of his activities. Continuing along that same river towards the east, on the upper reaches, we come upon the Leonovsky Hermitage of the Saviour, some 110 miles from the mountain of Sisol. This hermitage was built by St. Stephen for the enlightenment of the neighboring inhabitants of the upper Bechegda. And there is another, St. Stephen's, built in honor of his patron saint, Stephen the proto-martyr and archdeacon. This stands some 33 miles to the south of the Sisol estuary, where the village of Votsha is now situated. It was founded so that the monks could influence the Zuriani living along the river Sisol and Luz. And even in the last century, several church verses were still being sung there in the Zuriansky tongue. To the west of Ozvim, in the place where the Urensk town church of the Protection now stands, St. Stephen founded the monastery of the Archangels. And 19 miles further from Urensk, on the left bank of the Bechegda, he planted the monastery of Silabinsk. These were to serve as places of refuge for monks coming from Russia, that they might influence the Zuriani of the northwestern regions. Thus, his eparchy spread out from Ozvim, which was Stephen's normal domicile. On all sides, it followed the courses of the rivers for several hundred miles, 500 versts, which is to say 333 miles or more. Having been solicitous for the illumination and well-being of the Zuriani during his lifetime, St. Stephen did not cease to benefit them even after death. And though his labor-loving body was to be found lying peacefully in Moscow, in spirit he cared for his flock, appearing sometimes even visibly. One of the highest appearances after his repose was recorded by his contemporaries and has come down to us. In Vishera, which was inhabited by ardent admirers of Pama the Sotnik, by stubborn and inveterate idol worshippers, where many of the sorcerers and warlocks had retreated in the face of Stephen's preaching, their Christianity did not have any great success during the hierarch's life. Regardless of all the bishop's labors, only a few in that area were baptized. They did not even have a church there, and the newly baptized assembled to pray in a single small chapel. In the year that the hierarch proposed, One day, after morning prayers in the chapel, the Bishertzi noticed the boat sailing against the current on the river Vishera. There was no one in the boat, but on the opposite bank, over against the village, there stood a gray-haired old man. He sternly ordered the people to honor the precious treasure that God was sending to the Bishersky land. When the boat came to the bank, the old man became invisible. The astonished Bishertzi approached the boat with trembling and saw therein an icon of the Mother of God wondrously drawn, and before it a candle still burned. Perplexity and fear were replaced by joy. The Bishertzi reverently carried the holy icon to their little chapel, and soon after this they were able to build the church in honor of the Mother of God, whose icon many marvels worked, attracting the whole of that northern borderland to Christianity. In the old man who had ordered them to take the icon, the people recognized their beloved hierarch Stephen. As his contemporaries regarded him as a zealous propagator of the Christian faith among the pagans, the blessed Stephen was speedily outnumbered among the choir of the saints by the church, according to the wish of Velika Philopius, who was bishop of Perm from 1472 to 1501. A service was written in his honor by Pachomius III. According to tradition, Stephen the hierarch was not only a preacher of the faith, but also an iconographer. Somewhat less than 12 miles from Urensk, in the church of the village of Irtovsky, is a wonder-working icon of the Savior, not made by hands, one of large proportions, which is painted by Stephen in the ancient Byzantine style. The Bozhemskaya church, 20 miles downstream of Urensk on the river Vechegda, was famed for a pair of ancient icons with the inscriptions upon them in Zuriansky. There is little doubt that these are executed by Saint Stephen. 3 times the notables of Oskolvatuk, the notables of Oskolova took one of the icons to their own, it runs together, it's not right, to their own parish of Silabinsk, which was formerly attached to the monastery. But mysteriously, the holy icon would appear again in Bozhemsk. Arsenius the bishop transferred the icons to the cathedral church of Vologotsk. This said Vindig, a wooden cross is preserved, which was made by St. Stephen, and which he had placed in the chapel made by the Urotsi. In the course of 4 centuries, both fires and the ravages of time have destroyed this chapel several times, but the destructive power of corruption has not touched this cross. Although the inscriptions engraved upon it are at the present time impossible to decipher, for the letters have faded in many places, and we really do not know whether the inscription were written in Russian or in the Zuriansky tongue. From the things that once belonged to Bishop Stephen, besides his staff, there are still preserved, in the 19th century, his wooden church calendar in the Russian Archaeological Society, and an icon of St. Nicholas the Wonderworker in Chudinsky Church, Stephen's linen sakos in the Solvychegodsky Church of the Annunciation. However, if this vestment actually belonged to Stephen, it must have been either a bishop's Philonian or Stacharian, and not a sakos, because in those days our bishops did not as yet have the right to wear the sakos. The prayers of our Holy Father Stephen, the Lord, have mercy on us. Amen.